The streets of Rome are on fire. Thousands are marching, chanting, and demanding answers, just days before a vote that could permanently reshape Italian democracy. What is this government really trying to do? And why are some of Italy's most respected legal minds sounding the alarm right now? Let us begin by setting the scene. On the 22nd and 23rd of March 2026, Italians will head to the polls to vote on what is being called the Nordio reform, a sweeping set of constitutional amendments to the Italian judiciary promoted by Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni's government and named after her Minister of Justice, Carlo Nordio. The referendum will ask voters whether they approve a constitutional law that would amend the Italian constitution in various aspects, most notably by proposing the constitutional separation of career paths between judges and public prosecutors, the splitting of the High Council of the Judiciary into two distinct bodies, and the selection of members by sortition rather than traditional election, as well as the establishment of a high disciplinary court to oversee disciplinary proceedings. Those are dense technical words, but behind them lies a political battle that has consumed Italy for months and which is now erupting onto its streets. Thousands of people protested this past Saturday against wars in the Middle East and judicial reforms proposed by Italy's conservative government, linking international tensions with a growing domestic political battle before the national referendum. In a remarkable fusion of grievances, demonstrators in central Rome carried banners against the conflict in the Middle East, alongside signs opposing the judicial reforms. Protesters waving red trade union banners and Palestinian and Cuban flags chanted, "Meloni government, resign," before the rally ended peacefully. The scenes were vivid, powerful, and deeply symbolic. This was not simply a protest about the technical details of how Italian judges are appointed. This was a broader cry against a government that many of its opponents believe is moving Italy in a dangerous direction. To understand why emotions are running so high, you need to understand the history. Italy's relationship with its judiciary is not a simple one. It is a relationship shaped by decades of political scandal, corruption, dramatic courtroom battles, and an almost constant tension between political power and judicial authority. Those of you who remember the 1990s in Italy will recall the Mani Pulite investigations, the so-called clean hands operation, which tore through the Italian political establishment and brought down an entire party system. Prosecutors and judges became, in the eyes of many Italians, the last line of defense against corruption at the highest levels of power. For others, particularly on the right, those same prosecutors became symbols of judicial overreach, politically motivated investigations, and what critics called the weaponization of the law against elected politicians. That tension has never truly been resolved, and it is that unresolved tension that has now reached its most dramatic expression in the form of this referendum. The Nordio reform represents the latest chapter in this long-standing tension, and in this respect, inherits much of Berlusconi's legacy in reshaping the relationship between politics and the judiciary. It makes three important changes: separating careers between judges and prosecutors, creating two separate self-governing bodies for judges and prosecutors, and establishing a high disciplinary court for both judges and prosecutors. The government insists this is about modernization and fairness. Meloni said the reforms are needed to tackle chronic delays in Italy's courts and restore public confidence in the legal system. And speaking at a campaign event in Milan just days ago, she put it plainly. Meloni told supporters that if justice doesn't work, if it's slow, inefficient, or unfair, then the whole machine gets stuck and everyone pays the consequences. For the government, the yes vote is a vote for accountability, for efficiency, for a judiciary that serves citizens rather than itself. They argue that judges and prosecutors currently belong to the same professional order, allowing individuals to switch roles throughout their careers, and that this blurs the line between accusation and judgment in a way that is fundamentally unfair to defendants. Separating those careers permanently, they say, is simply good sense. The reform's supporters argue that separating careers would raise judicial impartiality, strengthening the right to a fair trial, by creating organizational distance between judges and prosecutors. They also argue that the current system of electing members to the High Council of the Judiciary has been captured by internal judicial factions, known as currenti, which have turned appointments into a political game within the magistracy itself. Replacing elections with a lottery system, they say, would break the grip of those factions and make the judiciary more genuinely independent. But opponents tell a profoundly different story. And the scale of the opposition that has assembled against this reform is remarkable. A broader coalition of organizations inaugurated the committee Civil Society for No in the constitutional referendum, bringing together associations, jurists, and citizens to defend the Constitution, the autonomy of the judiciary, and oppose the Nordio law. Around 117 constitutional scholars joined its scientific committee, including 3 presidents emeritus of the Constitutional Court of Italy and a former vice president. This is not a fringe opposition. These are some of the most respected legal and academic figures in Italy. The group included, among others, the trade union CGIL, the Anti-Mafia Association Libera, the National Association of Italian Partisans, and the environmental organization Legambiente. The fact that Italy's most prominent anti-mafia organization is actively campaigning against this reform tells you something important. For groups like Libera, an independent and robust prosecutorial system is not an abstract constitutional principle. It is a matter of life and death. It is the difference between powerful criminal organizations being brought to justice and walking free. The prospect of weakening the constitutional shield around prosecutors, even incrementally, is something they regard as genuinely dangerous. The reform has proved highly controversial, raising concerns that it could undermine judicial independence in Italy, in ways comparable to developments observed in other countries such as Poland, Israel, and Mexico. That comparison to Poland is one that opposition figures have been making loudly and repeatedly. In Poland, what began as seemingly technical judicial reforms gradually eroded the independence of the courts, until the European Union took formal action against Warsaw for breaching the rule of law. Critics of the Nordio reform say they see the same pattern beginning in Italy, and they are determined to stop it before it goes further. The core fear repeated by many opponents is not that independence disappears immediately, but that the constitutional shield around the judiciary becomes weaker. The official No campaign has built much of its message around exactly this warning. They are also deeply skeptical of the government's claim that the reform will speed up Italian justice. Several analysts and critics have pointed out that the constitutional text itself does not contain concrete measures that would directly reduce trial length. If the reform will not actually fix the problems ordinary Italians face in the courts, they ask, then what is its real purpose? Those concerns are amplified by the government's confrontational attitude toward the judiciary and other independent institutions. Deputy Prime Minister Matteo Salvini has previously attacked the judiciary over the country's migration law, arguing that if they don't like the migration law, they should run for election. Italy's Defense Minister Guido Crosetto has described judicial opposition as the main threat to the government, and Prime Minister Meloni herself has claimed that many judges display substantial indifference to the will of the majority. For opponents of the reform, these statements are not the words of a government seeking neutral technical improvements. They are the words of a government that views the judiciary as an obstacle, and the reform as a way to reduce its power. The constitutional revision submitted to this referendum is part of the government's broader strategy of institutional changes, which also includes the direct election of the Prime Minister and the enhancement of asymmetric regional autonomy. Taken together, critics argue, these reforms amount to a systematic concentration of power in the executive, a gradual rewriting of Italy's post-war constitutional architecture in ways that could prove very difficult to reverse. The political stakes have become so enormous that the referendum has essentially transformed into something it was perhaps never supposed to be. Meloni needed to avoid the referendum coming to be framed across the fragmented arenas of public debate as a plebiscite on her premiership. And yet that is precisely what appears to have happened. The referendum has increasingly taken on the character of a political test for the Prime Minister, with Meloni joining the campaign directly this week. When the head of government steps personally onto the campaign trail for a constitutional referendum, it sends a signal. It raises the stakes. It makes the outcome personal. A no vote will inevitably be read, at least in part, as a verdict on Meloni herself. Government supporters are framing a yes vote as a vote for accountability, the normalization of judicial power, and the rejection of a self-referential judiciary. Opponents are framing the vote in terms of the defense of constitutional guarantees, in the conviction that a yes vote cannot but contribute to undermining judicial authority. Both sides have drawn sharp battle lines, and the Italian public is being asked to choose between two fundamentally different visions of what justice, democracy, and the proper relationship between politics and law should look like. One of the most striking episodes in the lead-up to the vote involves not a speech or a court ruling, but a video. On the 18th of January 2026, the historian Alessandro Barbero publicly announced his opposition to the reform in a video message explaining his reasons. On the 23rd of January, the video was removed by Meta Platforms, prompting the Democratic Party to submit a parliamentary inquiry addressed to Prime Minister Meloni regarding the episode. The removal of a prominent public intellectual's commentary on a constitutional referendum from a major social media platform, just weeks before the vote, provoked outrage among opposition politicians who saw it as an attempt to silence dissent during a critical democratic moment. A separate controversy emerged when Giussi Bartolozzi, Chief of Staff of the Ministry of Justice, controversially stated, "Vote yes, so we can get rid of the judiciary," and that she was running away from the country if the reform is rejected. Those remarks drew criticism not just from the opposition, but the government itself distanced itself from the language, though notably it refused to call for Bartolozzi's resignation. Moments like these have fed a narrative among opponents that the Yes campaign is motivated not by sober constitutional reasoning, but by a desire to settle old political scores with an institution that has, at various points, investigated members of Italy's governing parties. Beyond Italy's borders, the referendum is being watched with considerable attention. The European institutions have long expressed concern about the independence of judiciaries across member states. The Venice Commission, the Council of Europe's body on democratic standards, has placed judicial independence and the composition of judicial councils at the center of its concerns. The principle that at least half of the members of judicial councils must be judges elected by their peers is an integral part of the rule of law, both according to the Council of Europe's standards and the case law of the Strasbourg Court. The Nordio reform's use of sortition to select council members rather than judicial election raises questions about whether Italy's new system would meet those European standards. And then there is the broader European context. Italy is not alone in experiencing this kind of political and institutional turbulence. Across Europe, governments of various orientations have at times tested the limits of their constitutional arrangements. The independence of courts, the accountability of prosecutors, the balance between democratic majorities and independent institutions, these are live debates in country after country. What happens in Italy on the 22nd and 23rd of March will not just determine the shape of Italian justice. It will send a signal, one way or another, about the direction of European democracy. A no vote defends the existing constitutional balance and argues for improvements through ordinary reforms. A yes vote aims to strengthen credibility through clearer separation of roles, reduced scope for internal factional gatekeeping, and a more visibly distinct disciplinary architecture. Whichever way the Italian people vote, the challenge of delivering faster, fairer, and more accessible justice will remain. The referendum alone cannot solve the chronic delays, the understaffed courts, or the backlogs that make Italian justice so frustrating for ordinary citizens. But it can and will determine the institutional framework within which Italy tries to address those problems. A quorum is not required for the referendum to be valid. The constitutional law will be confirmed if approved by a simple majority of valid votes. That means every vote counts. That means turnout will matter. That means the outcome genuinely hangs in the balance. Polling suggests a deeply divided country. The campaign has reached fever pitch. The streets are full of passion, and in just days, the Italian people will render their judgment. Whatever the result, Italy will wake up on the morning of the 24th of March facing profound questions. If the yes side wins, the government will claim a mandate. But the battle over implementation and the follow-on reforms to come will begin immediately. If the no side prevails, the opposition will declare that the people have defended their constitution, but the underlying tensions between the government and the judiciary will not simply dissolve. They will continue, perhaps in sharper form. What Italy is living through right now is a reminder of something fundamental. Democracy is not a fixed condition. It is a continuous process, a constant negotiation between power and accountability, between majorities and institutions that exist precisely to check those majorities. The courts, the prosecutors, the independent bodies that stand outside the direct control of elected governments. These are not obstacles to democracy. They are part of it. They are what makes it durable. They are what gives citizens a place to turn when power is abused. The protesters in Rome this week understand that. The constitutional scholars who have rallied against the reform understand that. And the Italians who will support the reform also understand in their own way that the current system has real problems that need solving. The question, the genuinely difficult, genuinely important question, is whether this particular reform, at this particular moment, under this particular government, is the answer. We will continue to follow every development as Italy moves toward this historic vote. We will bring you the results, the analysis, and the implications as they unfold. This is Nova Euro News, and we are watching Rome tonight. Stay informed, stay engaged, and we will see you in the next report.